The corona crisis has shaken the world economies. In Finland and Sweden, the governments are working on different packages of measures to save jobs and stimulate the economy, while at the same time putting sustainability issues at the center. In some few weeks, we will know more about the measures, since both governments are eagerly working with proposals for the state budget for the next coming year. It's almost 11 years since the world was shaken by a similar crisis. On the 15th of September 2008, the investment bank Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. And that was the beginning of a financial crisis that rocked the economy around the world. What lessons can be learned from the previous crisis, and what are the mistakes that we need to avoid this time? How to promote transition to a sustainable economy, and what role can the European Union play in this? To discuss the financial crisis and what we can learn from that time while dealing with the current crisis, I'm happy to welcome two former ministers of finance from Finland and Sweden to discuss this. Jyrki Katainen is joining us from his office in Helsinki, and Anders Borg is present here at the Finnish Institute in Stockholm. Jyrki was Minister for Finance between 2007 and 2011. After that, he became Prime Minister, and then he went to Brussels to work as a Vice President for jobs, growth, investment, and competitiveness of the European Union from 2014 to 2019. And since the beginning of this year, he is the president of the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra, and that is one of the most important forces in restarting the economy in Finland. And Anders, you were working as Minister of Finance for 8 years in Sweden, and now you are a member of several companies as well as advisor for Nordic Capital, East Capital, and IP Soft. It's a great pleasure for us to have you both with us today. Approximately 200 persons has signed up for this seminar, and it's following us from different parts of at least Sweden and Finland. The working language will be English. You can participate in the discussion through a Q&A function at Zoom, and you are also welcome to participate in the discussion on social media using hashtag Hållbar Nystart. My colleagues Jana and Karin are waiting for your questions and will put them forward to Anders and Jyrki. Since both of you were ministers of finance during the previous crisis, 2008, 2009, I can start with, I think it's a good idea to start with your experiences from that time. First of all, Jyrki, it will be nice to hear you telling some insights. How were you working with the financial crisis 11, 12 years ago when 20 different countries' interests need to be taken into account? How did you manage to contact everybody, and what kind of contact did you have with others?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the organizers for this very, very pleasant event. And it's always very nice to be in the same event together with Anders, who, by the way, consider as my brother. We became brothers in arms during the financial crisis, and I must say that every time for instance, in ECOFIN Council meeting, when I wasn't quite sure what to say or what to do or what kind of position to take, I followed Anders. So our relationship was very, very close, and we learned from each other, and there are lots of interesting anecdotes or stories to tell. Maybe we could write a book together, for instance, how we reacted when we both saw that the crisis is going to hit Baltic countries. It's another story, but we were at the very center of this looming crisis in Baltic countries. We started to help them, and we wanted to help Baltic countries to survive, and we did our share to contribute to. But the financial crisis was a big mystery for all of us. Nobody had seen the similar crisis before because it went so deeply to the financial sector. And even though there had been financial crises before, but not exactly this kind of crisis, because we had not seen that well developed financial sector before going into the crisis. And I remember very often we did not know exactly what is going to happen next, and that's why for the policymakers it was very difficult to react. So we needed to believe in certain type of expectations, and especially we needed to believe in our values. What is right thing to do? If you don't know exactly, then it's better to follow values. And here again, we happen to represent the similar type of thinking and values together with Anders. I remember very often when I participated to Eurogroup meetings, I needed to leave Helsinki for Brussels without knowing what is the agenda, because the agenda was moving all the time. One anecdote I must share with you is that I remember when we established the crisis tool. The new fund, which was supposed to be used for euro area member states, not the bailout fund, but the fund which borrows money to the countries who cannot fund themselves from the market. I got a message from the European Commission that I is supposed to be ready to accept 60 billion euros fund, and I got kind of green light from the Parliament of Finland that I'm allowed to accept 60 billion euros facility. When I landed to Brussels, we heard from Commission that the overall sum has risen to 160 billion euros. And when I came back next morning, early morning, I had accepted 750 billion facility. Of course, together with the IMF, but nevertheless, big share of this money came from the member states. So this maybe tells something about the situation. Nobody really knew what is enough, what should be done, and we needed to compose reaction during the crisis and try to devise what is right thing to do.
Were you the victim of the same kind of surprises, Anders?
Well, I do think that Jyrki and I had a very close cooperation. First of all, we did have to deal with Iceland and Latvia. That was kind of where the Nordic countries took a leadership. And Jyrki was absolutely instrumental to getting those programs started. And both of us worked a lot with trying to manage the programs, and not the least quite difficult relationship with the IMF during that period. And secondly, I would say that both I and Jyrki were a part of a group of very constructive ministers. Christine Lagarde obviously should be mentioned there. So we tried to be a part of a constructive majority to find solutions, where I think both Sweden and Finland were quite active in the council. There were other countries that was standing on the sideline and just refused or didn't want to cooperate, but I do think that Sweden and Finland were constructive members. And thirdly, I think we took a very similar approach to what type of policy that was needed. Jyrki quoted Winston Churchill saying, never waste a good crisis. I remember him saying that many times, and this was what we tried to do in Sweden, in Finland, and the type of policies that we also pushed in, for example, Latvia, that you need to take into account the long-term growth impact. You have to deal with the crisis, but you also have to really dig into your long competitiveness issues. So It was periods when we spoke almost on a daily basis, and many times I remember in the council that I had to leave early, and once I said, I think that was actually the informal ECOFIN in Marseille under the French presidency, where I said, well, Jyrki, can you just take my vote and use it according to what you believe that I would do? Because I mean, we really shared values and had a very, very close cooperation.
And the relations between Sweden and Finland was very special at that time, because the economies were integrated to each other. I mean, one of the greatest banks in Finland was Nordea, the same bank was in Sweden. Were these circumstances that took you into a even further, even tighter cooperation, that the economies were so tight? Jyrki, what's your picture of the Swedish and Finnish relationship at that time?
It was obviously very, very integrated and close, but it was not only because of our integrated economy, but also because we both had gone through economic crises in the early 90s. So we had similar experiences. We had, I mean, both countries went through banking crisis, but also real economic crisis. That was something which many other countries in Europe hadn't experienced. And I mean, maybe earlier on, but not since the beginning of 90s. So this was one of the explanations why we had more or less the same type of ideas. Also, the basic orientation was very same in a sense that we both are representing open economy. We don't want to protect our market or our economy from the external competition. On the contrary, and I remember many times that some of our colleagues wanted to protect Europe from external competition in order to get some advantage, but we didn't believe in this. This is one of the examples of the values what I mentioned earlier. So the overall orientation, how we see the role of public sector, how we see our positioning vis-a-vis the global market, etc. It was the reason why it was so easy to share the same type of policies.
We are talking about Nordic values, but you were also representing the same party, the Conservative Party in Sweden and Finland, Anders. Was that an advantage?
I think it was an advantage, but I must say that I've cooperated with other Nordic ministers, and I must say that we also have quite strong Nordic values. We believe in strong public finances, we believe in efficiency and growth, we believe in flexible labor markets and free trade. But I must say that Jyrki was mentioning the crisis in the 90s, and when we helped Latvia, I think Finland, Sweden and Denmark sent almost 20 people to Latvia to help them out. And I think it was a huge advantage that we could actually send people from our central banks and our ministries that had been a part of this process of restructuring the budget in the early 90s. So it was not that we came with some academic advice, it was actually people with direct know-how of how to do this that came and helped them. And I do think that the fact that Finland sent some people and Sweden some people really boosted the confidence of the Latvians, because I think they felt that these were neighbor countries that were taking their side in this difficult process. And obviously IMF and the Commission also helped out, but I do think that the Nordic hands-on approach, based on our common experience of crises, made it more credible.
So what went right and what went wrong then when you look at this crisis 11, 12 years ago? What is your main experience, Jyrki? What was the mistakes and what was the positive results of the way you handled the financial crisis 2008, 2009? What can we learn?
Well, if looking at today's crisis, there are obvious lessons learned from the financial crisis, even though the nature of the two crises are very different. So whereas in financial crisis, it was relevant to focus on the weaknesses of national economic policies, or budgetary policies or taxation, COVID-19 crisis is not that much about mistakes made in national economic policies. So in financial crisis, in other words, we were forced to concentrate on the weaknesses in certain countries, because that was the reason why they get into the trouble. Whereas in COVID, the problem comes from outside. Of course, the stronger your economy is, more resilient you are, and vice versa. There is some connection, but the very nature of the crisis is very different. Now, if looking at what the central banks have done, they obviously have learned a lesson. They have been faster in their reactions. The magnitude of the operations has been bigger, and we have not ended up to the situation where market forces start to bet what is the first country which will fail. So this is one, I guess, lesson learned from central bank's point of view. Also, the EU response has been different. We have now, during this crisis, we have managed to make decisions on stimulus packages. Of course, they are controversial, and you can always say that they should be different kind of packages. But nevertheless, this kind of stimulus package has been possible to set up. So in this time around, we were more ready to react, even though the nature of the crisis is different. The overall or underlying problems in national economies have not, unfortunately, disappeared at all. And this is, I'm not sure if it's a mistake, but at least one could say that we have not used the time from the previous crisis for putting our public finances in good shape. And that's why some of the European countries have been unnecessarily fragile. So European Central Bank especially has paved the way for member states to enjoy quite smooth financial environment, even though there are lots of things to correct in certain countries.
Anders?
Well, I very much agree with what Jyrki is saying. I remember the night when that Jyrki was referring to in spring 2010, when we set up this 750 billion rescue package. Even during the night, we didn't really know how the central banks would respond. This time, the central banks really have been front-loading. The ECB, I think, have done exactly the right thing. And I also think that the fact that we already now has a package on a European level is a huge advantage. I mean, it took almost half a year after the Lehman crash until we had this fund in Europe up and running. So I do think that this is well, it was actually almost 2 years because it was from 8 to 10. So this response has been more forceful, and I think that's good. I do think that there is a difference here, and that crisis was a financial crisis, so it really didn't change the structure of the economy. This time we see, at the same time as the COVID crisis, a huge technological change. So e-commerce have completely exploded. Digital payments have gone from maybe 10% to 30-40% in many countries. We have changed our work habits. We used to sit in offices. Now we can work from almost anywhere. And partly that is because we now have cloud computing. So even with small laptops, we can access really strong and powerful IT support. So in one sense, maybe I think that COVID-19 crisis will change our societies more. Yeah. We didn't wonder whether Volkswagen or Volvo would produce diesel trucks during the crisis. This time we don't know whether everybody will want to drive a Tesla. At that time we understood that people would be buying their clothes at H&M also after the crisis. This time we don't really know where consumer behavior, work patterns, innovation will go. And on top of that, we are much more aware of the sustainability dimension has to be more front-loaded than it was back in 2008. So I do think that this crisis coincides with a huge technological change that will probably have broader impact. But obviously, I agree what Jyrki said on also the need for structural strengthening of particularly of some of the southern European countries, where they haven't used the last 10 years to improve competitiveness. And COVID is a force that hits everybody, but the more fragile you are, the more structural issues you have, the weaker your public finances are, the more costly is the adjustment.
But it sounds like the transition agenda was set already before the COVID-19 crisis. So in fact, we are talking about reforms that anyhow have to be.
I would say yes and no. I mean, if you look at e-commerce, we would have seen the same change, but it would have taken 5 years or 10 years.
Yeah.
Now we can see that it's actually happening in 3 months.
They have to be speeded up.
Yeah.
Do you share this opinion, Jyrki?
Yeah, that's true. Everybody is talking about the digital leap. We don't quite see it yet. What does it mean in practice? Anders mentioned e-commerce. It's obvious example, but one thing is sure, and it's what Anders mentioned, that we have learned. We have new consumers. We have new people in terms of digital skills. In normal situation, it would have taken for years to have or to gain same type of knowledge we have today. So I'm really curious and quite enthusiastically waiting for this digital leap, especially how this new skill space is used for instance, for public services. In both countries, in Sweden and Finland, public sector plays a crucial role. And in both countries, citizens are quite well digitally equipped, and now the skills level has increased significantly. So it would be odd if we wouldn't change the way we produce public services, and it would help to improve the quality, accessibility, but also efficiency of public services.
So I'm very much in agreement with Jyrki here. I do think that Finland, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands are probably the front runners. The crisis hits everybody, but we are much more digital. Our consumers, our taxpayers, our citizens are already digitally trained. So I'm not that worried about the North European area, and I do think that the rescue program will be very efficient in Central Eastern Europe, where you have well-educated programmers and good mathematicians. So the northern part of Europe, I think, is probably coming out of this in decent shape. I'm more worried that this competitiveness divide in Europe. The rescue program is good because it tries to help out, but I'm still worried that we can have a two-speed Europe, where a strong North European, German-centered production supply chain even will have benefits out of nearshoring, that the European supply chains become stronger, while I'm quite worried about what will happen with Greece, Italy, and Spain, where they are worse hit by the disease, where they don't have this digital front-loading. So it is the same problems that come back in a different shape.
You wrote about a digital jump in an article recently. What more exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I already mentioned the public services. Yesterday, I had a chance to discuss with the rector of University of Jyväskylä, Finnish university, and it's the university who is educating teachers. And he said that last spring was the first time when all the teacher students did they practice or they training partially online. So So now we have a new generation of teachers who are practically trained online partially. I see it as a positive chance. So even though the profession will continue to be like it used to be, but nevertheless they are digitally more educated and trained than before. The second point is that, and this comes to close what Sitra is doing, we pay attention to data economy, which means that we have to create ethically sustainable rules for using data. Okay, now we have better trained consumers, and now we have to concentrate on developing new market for digital services. For instance, we are educating small and medium-sized enterprises to change their business model so that they can use their clients' personal data based on the licenses. So the customers are giving permission for the companies to use their data, and they are in return producing services. So I must underline that I believe in this experience which we had, or which we caught during the spring, that we are more ready to use new type of services, and this can be a new start of economic growth which we have not seen before.
So I work with close to 100 different companies within Kinnevik, Nordic Capital, and some other groups that I advise. And the strange thing is that if I look at those companies that are basically all digital, whether it's e-commerce, e-health, or fintech, this crisis has been very strange, because they have seen revenues grow 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% during the crisis. While if you look at traditional industry, basically they are down 30% in revenue. So it's like a complete gap in the economy between the digital side and the traditional side. And that is something that we really have to bridge. And I agree what Jyrki is saying, that we are now using a lot of new digital tools. What worries me is that almost all of these tools, whether we talk about cloud computing, big data, Teams, or whatever service we are using, almost all these technology is American. In the US, you have maybe
Chinese.
Well, not so much Chinese. In the front line, it's almost 80% US innovation and technology. So the problem is a little bit that Europe is becoming users of technology. If you were talking about diesel engines or ship construction, Europe would be in the lead. And we are leading, but we're leading in the old sectors, while the US is booming ahead in the tech space. And I think that's a huge challenge for Europe, where we really need to transform ourselves.
And how to take care of that challenge?
Okay, thank you.
Both of you.
Well, it's not an easy task. Before I answer to this question, I must say that we had a project here in Sitra where we had 5 or 10 people who deliberately wanted to be testers. So we were looking at when they are using the iPads and mobile phones and surfing on web, where their data is going to. And 80% of these people's data went to the United States. So there's not even data users in Europe today. So it's very true what Anders said, that we are technology users, and we are also giving the data to Americans at the moment. So we don't produce technology, neither we don't do anything about our own data. So this must be changed. How to change this? Medium to long-term answer is that basically today there are 2 models. The Chinese model to use data, which basically means that the government is using people's data, and nobody wants to go to this direction. Then there's another way to produce services and use data and produce technology. It's what American big tech companies are providing. I don't say that it's American model, because the US government is not that much involved in this. but it's mostly about what the big companies are ready to provide, and we are the users. So what is the Europe's role? I think the use of data and digital services is underdeveloped. We are more or less in the similar situation where our financial sector was in 1960s. So we don't have global rules, we don't have competition. So what is Europe's opportunity here is to set up a sustainable set of rules which will encourage people to trust on data services. So unless you trust on database services, you don't use them. And I believe that this will prevail over the time, but it will take some time to set up this new rule book. But then we simply need more investment in this sector. We need simply investment, and now we come to the COVID crisis. All the countries, public sectors using massive amount of public taxpayers' money for stimulating the economy. There is no reason why we should stimulate or save all the old companies. Instead, we should look at the future and stimulate new business models, new business opportunities, and for instance, digital infrastructure is one of those.
And another key area, of course, is sustainable development. And in the same article that I referred to earlier, Jyrki, you are writing that this is an opportunity to make important long-step decisions in the field of sustainable development. What do you actually mean by that? What do you think actually should be done?
I have very simple thinking on this, that nobody expected that taxpayers are ready to finance that much investment and support the recovery of economy. We were not expecting this amount of public money to be used for our economy. But now we are in the situation where the stimulus efforts are necessary. And this leads to the thinking that it's better to use it the way it builds more resilient and more sustainable economy in the long term. We doesn't need to save all businesses, even though it's quite hard to say. But nevertheless, we should look at what is the best value for money, for taxpayers' money, and how to build more sustainable future. Now I'm talking about renewable energy, circular economy for sure, and digital economy. So here again, it's possible to make future leaps forward. There's no power in a world which would force us to return to square one, because we are nevertheless going forward.
Do you agree, Anders, that it's a good idea to use public money to invest in sustainable development?
Well, I do think that the rescue program is forward-leaning. A large part of that will be used for the green transition and also for the new digital circular economy. So I do think that it's right that the Commission is pushing those issues, but I think also we need to be clear that the US technology lead is built by Facebook, Google, Amazon, Nvidia, Salesforce, Adobe, and other private companies. These companies come out of a much more vibrant entrepreneurial culture, where you scale up to a enormous scale within 1 or 2 decades. In Europe, the entrepreneurial climate is not of the same standard. We are struggling with a few unicorns. Zalando, that I worked a lot with, is one of them. But in deep technology, when it comes to microchips or AI, we really don't have a European unicorn. We don't have even a 200 or 300 billion tech company in Europe. So I do think that we need to really change the culture. Entrepreneurship has to be pushed forward. We have to be proud of our entrepreneurs. In Sweden, we have Klarna, Izettle, Spotify, and others. That's a source of national pride. But also our tax system needs to be much more friendly to unlisted investments in startup companies. if you compare the investment regime in the US to that in Europe, it's a little bit better here in the Nordics, but fundamentally we really provide the fertile breeding ground for unicorns that they do in the US. And there's a big risk in this because many of the large funds and many of the large companies are US companies. So even when we develop Skype here in Sweden, it's and Estonia and Finland, it is taken over by Microsoft and it's turned into Teams, and then it's actually owned by US technology. So one part where I agree with Jyrki, and where I think the Commission has done the right thing, is to put money on the table. But when it comes to the large, difficult structural issues and entrepreneurial climate, we are actually not improving in Europe. And the best country we had was obviously the UK, and they have left us. So particularly in AI, where they were basically 40% of all AI investments, that's a huge problem. So France, Germany, Italy, Spain, but also the Nordics need to really revamp our tax system. We can have still quite high taxes because that's necessary for the welfare state, but we need to have a much more entrepreneurial friendly tax system.
Not all the buildings should be rebuilt after an earthquake. I think I'm still quoting you one more time now, Jyrki. What kind of buildings shouldn't be rebuilt after the COVID-19, Anders?
I actually already stole that quote from Jyrki and used it a couple of times. I think it's a very good description. We need to concentrate on the buildings that are really fundamental for our future. And you can't underestimate the importance of technology. And the core asset here is mathematicians and engineers. Finland and Sweden have a long tradition in that area, but we really need to scale up.
But which are the buildings that shouldn't be rebuilt?
I think the market will do the creative destruction process on its own.
What did you bear in mind when you said this, Jyrki?
Well, I don't have any particular company in my mind or even a sector, because sometimes traditional sectors, traditional industrial companies can be very agile. I know many of them who have changed their business model. So for instance, I mean, traditional industries like steel or forest industries can be very, very modern, as they are. They have spent R&D resources for using biomass for different type of products, which we did not expect to happen ever. So I don't have any particular sector in my mind, but obviously business models which are not sustainable in terms of carbon or CO2 perspective, it's quite obvious choice not to save.
Both your old parties are in opposition at the time, but you both seems to be very satisfied with the policy that is run by the governments in both Sweden and Finland. Do you mostly agree with your successor Magdalena Andersson and the measures she has been taken?
Well, I do think that both the Finnish and the Swedish government, and I would also add Denmark there to this Nordic dimension, I do think that they've responded. To my mind, they could do more. We have very strong public finances in all of the three countries, so I think we could do even more, and I would really support them if they come out with strong measures also for next year and the year after. But there is one dimension where I'm worried, and that's the growth and competitiveness dimension. It's good that we save jobs, it's good that we support existing industries, but the big issue is, where will the entrepreneurial climate be in 5 years? And what I think Jyrki did during the crisis, and that I was very supportive of, and that we tried to do in Sweden, was also to do structural changes. We for example, cut corporate taxes. We improved taxation on unlisted companies. We invested more in research and development, put a lot of money into the universities. And I think this dimension to strengthen the recovery, because after the last crisis, we had something that people coined as secular stagnation, that investments didn't come back, productivity was low for a long period, And that I think is an overhanging risk also this time. So I would be supportive of them being even more future-oriented and more forward-leaning when it comes to particularly technology.
So do you mean that this has been a rescue operation so far?
It should be a rescue operation so far, and therefore I think they've done basically the right things. But now we need to turn the page and look for the next 5 to 10 years. Where do we want our countries to be? And then you need to do more, I think, in long-term and structural issues.
You were working in Matti Vanhanen's government as a finance minister, Jyrki, and now Vanhanen has replaced you as Minister of Finance in Finland. Do you think he's doing a good job?
I think he's doing a good job. And I was, even though I tried to avoid commenting everyday politics in Finland, but I must say that I was very satisfied that Centre Party chose him as a new Minister of Finance. He's very experienced and gone through economic crises, and he has kind of perspective to look at the future too. So I'm satisfied. I would like to build on what Anders said, that that Nordic model. I firmly believe this Nordic societal model is prevailing model also in the future, but we have to renew it. We cannot afford for nostalgic thinking of Nordic model. The Nordic model in 80s or 90s or early 2000 is not the model for the future. I mean, what is worth saving is the inclusive model of our social system, transparency, global openness, and also competitiveness. And the latter part is the one which you have to be ready to renew every single year. This competitiveness today is not the same as competitiveness 5 years ago, even less 10 years ago. So that's why we cannot just pick and choose one part of the Nordic model, which is very often very generous social security system or inclusiveness. So if we want to safeguard or protect this part of the model, we have to be ready to reform our competitiveness. So sometimes it means quite painful decisions to reform structures. Yeah, I mean, a simple thing as raising the retirement age, which is not a major reform, but nevertheless, it's always very, very difficult. Even though everybody can understand that as we live longer, we have to contribute more. So I just raised this as one typical classic example of reforms which must be done every once in a while. But there are many others. So in order to keep this Nordic model alive, we must be ready to reform.
So I think Sweden and Finland almost always look like Siamese twins when it comes to macroeconomic data. We are almost always very, very similar. But this time I think there is a difference, and that is that in Sweden we have seen youth unemployment completely skyrocketing. We are now at almost 30% in youth unemployment. We have actually only one country where it's increased more, and that's Portugal. So it's just Spain and Greece that are higher than Sweden currently in youth unemployment. And that I think is a huge challenge, particularly with our migration history, where many of these unemployed young people are people that has quite newly arrived to Sweden. And there I actually think that that's probably in social terms, our biggest challenge. If we can't provide hope, future and opportunity for these people, social cohesion will come under strain. And I know that the Swedish government and the partners on the labor market is discussing this. When I was working with the Finnish government, that was a big issue also in Finland. And I do think that this crisis have really reinforced the need to reform our labor market, to become more flexible, to reduce the barriers of entry into the labor market, particularly for young people, and also to scale out educational resources. Because if we come out of this crisis with 30% youth unemployment, that is a phenomenon that we will have to live with it for at least 5 to 10 years afterwards. So competitiveness is important. But I think a core of the Nordic model is this willingness to continue to reform and be pragmatic and agnostic, to rethink and change. So for Sweden, that's a huge, I'm not sure, maybe Jyrki can enlighten us, but I don't think I've seen the same data in Finland on youth unemployment so far.
It has risen, but not necessarily very dramatically. I don't know, I must admit that I don't know exactly the reason why this is so. But of course, youth unemployment is an issue also in Finland, but not necessarily, the change hasn't been that drastic as you described in Sweden.
We have now been talking about the rescue operation that the governments are carrying out at the moment, and investment, at least partly financed with borrowed money. What will happen then? Do we have to pay the money back?
Well, I'm not that worried.
No. Okay.
Interest rates are extremely low. Nor Sweden nor neither Finland is paying almost anything when we are borrowing. There is a solid trust. I speak to market participants, the large investment banks and hedge funds almost on a daily basis. I remember back in the 90s, then nobody trusted us. Today we are the AAA countries. We are trusted, we are credible. So I really think that one should use this, but then I must add, I do think that when the crisis is over, but that might be in 23 or something like that, then we need to go back to surplus targets and to pay back some of this debt and go back to a more strict regime.
And budget cuts.
I don't think we need budget cuts. I think we will automatically, with growth, restore a large part of this. But I do think we need to reduce debt, because this is not the last crisis. It might take 5 or 10 years before we have the next global crisis, but it will come, and we need to prepare. So now we need to spend and cut taxes and do more investments, but then in the medium term we have to go back to being more stringent and conservative on fiscal issues.
Do we have to, the Finnish people have to expect saving lists, as it is put in Finnish, Jyrki, in the future?
Well, it's possible. It's possible. It's a combination. I mean, getting over this crisis needs a package which consists real measures to improve competitiveness. Obviously, we need new measures to promote or create incentives for growth. Growth is not an option, it's a necessity. And there we come to the entrepreneurship, for instance, what Anders mentioned. So competitiveness measures, growth measures, but also we have to be very vigilant to protect our credibility. And there societal structural reforms, but also maybe some fiscal measures are needed. I'm not sure yet, but maybe this is part of the package. So if looking at the last couple of years, the amount of public expenditure has risen quite significantly, and I'm not very sure whether this is sustainable or not. So I want to keep all the options open and just to say to people that better be ready to protect our credibility, and it may need some fiscal measures, i.e. Budget cuttings, because we cannot afford to raise taxes anymore.
Are you afraid of how the voters will react in case there will be cuttings in the public budgets? I mean, raising sympathies for populists, and I mean, after the First World War and the Spanish flu, we saw the support for the Nazi party growing in those areas in Germany where they have a lot of Spanish flu cases. Is there a relation between a flu, a pandemic, and the public political opinion?
I'm not particularly worried about the Nordic countries. We tend to be responsible and fairly moderate in our response to crises. But on a global scale, I'm very worried. We see that the relationship between China and the US is becoming more and more difficult. hostile. It's portrayed like a big power struggle or even an ideological battle. And that's very dangerous for our Nordic region, because we are among the most open. We are depending on world trade. So this new climate, I mean, we only have to look at what is happening in US, where you see now armed militias. People are already starting about contesting the election result. The fringes are getting stronger in both of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. So yeah, I'm worried that the center might not hold, and if the center doesn't hold, we are in deep trouble.
I will check with Jana if we have any questions from the audience, or otherwise we will soon round up this discussion. One question, Jana will forward it to you.
What happened with the brother in arms mentality between Finland and Sweden when the COVID-19 hit us? Here in the Torneo River Valley, we suddenly have closed borders guarded by heavily armed military people. What do you think this will do to the countries' trust to each other in the future?
Yeah, who would like to answer that first? Jyrki, did you hear the question?
Oh, yes, I heard. Yeah, I understand very well this question, and I understand that people are very dissatisfied and to a certain extent annoyed that the border is not open as we have got used to see it open. So, but I hope that people would understand or take a very pragmatic approach. Mm-hmm. So this virus goes beyond politicians' power, and politicians tries to limit it as much as possible. So we had our own, I mean, within Finland, Nyland, the southern part of Finland was closed down, and I could not go to see my parents in eastern Finland, for instance. So we have done these kind of measures within a country, and this has, I mean, once the Finnish government has limited cross-border crossings between Finland and Sweden, it has nothing against Sweden. We just try to limit the virus as much as possible. But of course, it's very strange thing, and it causes trouble to many people who have got used to go cross border or even work cross border.
Do you ever think that the Nordic cooperation has been hurted by the coronavirus, since it's not only the border between Finland and Sweden up in the north that has been closed, even the border between Norway and Sweden, between Sweden and Denmark as well? What had happened to the Nordic spirit?
Yes and no, I would say. Yes, it has changed. No, it hasn't changed. It has changed now, and obviously there are some issues between the countries. They've chosen partly different policy response here. In the medium term, I'm not that worried. We are a small village, a small part of a large world. And I think any time when Jyrki and I have gone out in the big world, in IMF meetings and the EU and so forth, when you just sit in Stockholm or Helsinki, you might think that Finland and Sweden are very different. As soon as you leave the Nordic area, you notice that we are much more alike than we even can understand ourselves. So I'm not that worried. I think there is a robust trust between the populations, between the governments, and I think in the longer run, closer Nordic integration is a huge advantage for our region.
What can be gained then by a deeper cooperation between Sweden and Finland, your countries?
Well, I would like to raise the EU dimension here because, for instance, Brexit has put us to a new situation. So I happened to be in the same event a few months ago together with Chancellor Merkel, and Angela Merkel said that Germany's role in Europe is to try to find a common tone with France. But small countries like Sweden and Finland's role is to push forward right policies. And here we are talking about trade, single market, and fiscal responsibility, to mention a few. And when looking at a little bit deeper on single market, I would put focus on digital single market and also to promote the economy. We need a better circular economy single market in order to create a new, more sustainable market. So here, Finland and Sweden absolutely are representing the same type of thinking, and we have bigger responsibility within the European Union now than before.
Is this also a way to increase Sweden and Finland's influence inside the European Union?
Sorry, say it again?
Is it this a way also to increase Sweden and Finland's role inside the European cooperation?
Yeah, I mean, you can influence if you have lots of economic power or if you are a big country, but also you can influence by setting the agenda. So never underestimate the power of good ideas. So if Finland and Sweden, for instance, would manage to set the agenda which the others could follow or take a position, so it's the way to influence. And I'm sure that we are capable to increase our influence if we just work together.
What can be a common Swedish and Finnish agenda, Anders?
Well, I think Jyrki mentioned some of the headlines. Good fiscal policy, openness in terms of world trade, efficient government, focus on growth areas. And I do think that the forces from the outside is really pushing the Nordic countries closer together, because the fact that we don't have the UK on board anymore means that it's even more important that the Nordic area take up a bigger role in these policy discussions. We often have had allies like the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. Now the United Kingdom is not there. So the priority of European policy, I think, for the Nordic countries have become even more important. And when we have cooperated over the years, I think we've been most successful when all the Nordic countries have been working on the same agenda. So close policy cooperation between our governments, I think, is crucial. It's the only way forward. And so I think the demand on us to be willing and able to cooperate has strengthened.
And that brings us to my final question. What do you think we will learn from the COVID-19 crisis? Will Sweden and Finland be better countries after we have went through this great crisis? What do you say, Jyrki? How will the situation in Finland improve?
I'm future optimistic always. So I would repeat what Anders said before, never miss a good crisis. So we are not in a fundamental crisis at the moment. There are more opportunities to influence to the direction of the future now than, for instance, in financial crisis. It was really worrisome or scary crisis. So now we can really influence. And as I said before, there's no force in a world or no power in a world which would force us to return to square one, to the situation where we were in January, because we both countries or everybody wants to go forward. So now it's a matter of choosing right policies to take future leaps, whether it's digital or sustainability.
Will Sweden be a better or country after the COVID-19, and in what way?
I actually think so. I think we are, together with Finland, well positioned when it comes to technology, to openness, to digitalization and engineering. So I'm quite optimistic that some of our companies will benefit, and I hope our governments will be wise and spend more money on research and education and do improvements of the entrepreneurial climate. And I think the probability of that is much higher than in many other European countries. So I have a high confidence in the Nordic area, and I particularly think that when Sweden and Finland cooperates, we can produce a lot of good results.
And I think that is a good final word in this discussion, that we are looking forward with optimism to the future. Thank you for all the questions from the audience. Some of them were unfortunately too late to take part in the discussion. I really want to thank Jyrki in Helsinki and Anders here in Stockholm for this very inspiring discussion. And I think that if some of the decision makers today want to have some good advice, we will recommend them to listen on this discussion because it's taped and available on our web. Thank you very much for following.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.